In this second video on maintaining good mental health, based on the book I'm Not Supposed to Feel Like This, going to look at the impact of unhelpful thinking and behaviour. We will need to revisit a story that we used in the first of these videos, so I will recap it in a short while to help you. But some introductory comments first of all. The aim of this chapter is to help you to consider in more detail the impact that anxiety and depression may have on your thoughts and actions. In anxiety and depression, and for our purposes, in a situation like this where our mental health can be adversely affected by the circumstances in which we find ourselves being so restricted in terms of our movement and activity, it can sometimes feel to us that we see everything in a negative way. And this includes things like having a bias against yourself. We tend to beat ourselves up. We think negatively about ourselves. We're full of self-blame and critical self-talk. We convince ourselves that we can't do anything right, and we become our own worst critic. Now, going back to the story in the previous video, I'll recap it a little bit so that you know. We're going to kind of use this as a case study for how we sometimes indulge in this negative thinking. So this is the story. John's going shopping this morning. As he gets ready, he can't find his wallet. Immediately, he jumps to the very worst conclusion that his wallet and his credit cards have been stolen. He starts feeling anxious, has a sick feeling in his stomach, and feels a real tension in his head. So immediately, he phones the credit card company and the bank to cancel all his cards. Having done that, he phones his friend Anne, who he knows from a church group, a Bible study group, and talks to her for a few minutes, and explains to her what's happened. Anne is sympathetic and supportive and encourages him to try to remember where he's last seen his wallet, and says, why don't you have a look around the house, see if you can find it. So John says thank you and puts the phone down, disconnects. Whatever we do these days, when this book was written, we all put our phone down rather than disconnected it. John thanks her and he's pleased that he called her because he now feels a bit better. He says, I'll let you know if I find it, and that he'll see her that evening at their house group. Later that morning, John finds his wallet in his coat pocket. He'd forgotten that he'd put it there yesterday. And then it starts going wrong. John tries to avoid seeing or talking to Anne because he's worried that she will think he's a right fool and will ask him about this if he goes to the house group in the evening. So he decides, therefore, he won't go to house group that evening so he can avoid the embarrassment of seeing Anne. Now, to compound the error, what is going on in Anne's head? This is such an accurate story of what actually happens in real life. This really is incredibly common. So from Anne's perspective, she's phoned by her friend John, who's worried that he's lost his wallet. Anne knows that he's occasionally done this before and he's found his wallet later. So she tries to tell John that, look, you'll probably find your wallet later if you look in all the places that you may have left it, like drawers and trousers and coat pockets. So after John has rung off, Anne starts to worry that, did I sound a bit irritable towards John? Was I not supportive enough? She feels guilty and worries that she's upset him. And later on, she notices that John hasn't called her back to let her know whether or not he's found the wallet. Then John doesn't come to house group that she was leading that evening. And so that night, Anne lies awake worrying that their friendship has been harmed and that she's upset John. She decides not to phone John for a few days because she's not sure how he might react if she's really upset him. So you have this glorious situation that occurs over and over and over and over again in real life, where two people who want to support each other, who appreciate and care for each other, and can be a help and a support to one another, end up not speaking because they're both mind reading what the other person is thinking. So, going back to the impact of unhelpful thinking and behaviour, we read about this story about John and Anne, and this is how we often behave. We put a negative slant on events and things that happen to us. So it says, do you overlook or downplay the positive and focus instead on the negative side of every situation? Does it seem to you that you have a mental filter that sees only the negative? What's called a negative mental filter, as if you're looking at everything through dark or tinted glasses. So, for example, Anne sits at home by herself, feeling sad after the Bible study the house group has finished, and having not seen John. She thinks back to the phone conversation, and she's worried that she's upset him. She says to herself, the last week was completely awful. Nothing went right, and I've completely messed up my friendship with John. So you may know similar experiences in your own life when you've filtered what you've seen and heard and decided that your worth has been undermined. Almost certainly this is because of the way that you've filtered information. We tend to go from saying, "Ooh, I'm not sure that went right," to a situation where everything's gone wrong. You know that lovely rhyme that children sometimes use, and Lynn, my wife, sometimes uses it. Nobody loves me, everybody hates me. I'm going down the garden to eat some worms. The long, thin, slimy ones go down easily. The short, fat, hairy ones stick. But this idea that nobody loves me anymore, I've completely messed up. The whole thing was a disaster. And so we put this negative filter on the way we see things, all because of one incident which we may have misunderstood in the first place. Another thing we do, we tend to have a gloomy view of the future. So do you find yourself making negative predictions about the future and worry that the very worst will happen? This process of predicting that the very worst will happen is also called catastrophic thinking. It may include things like a loss of hope. At its very worst, it can even introduce into our mind ideas of suicide. So going back to the story of Anne and John, it's next Sunday, and John is at home at 9:30. The church service begins in half an hour. All the best churches meet at 10 o'clock in the morning. John says, I'm not going to go this morning. All my house group will be there and they'll be critical of me. I'll feel isolated and I'll probably be told not to come back. The minister or one of the leaders will want a few words with me and will tell me how inconsiderate I've been. I'll have to try to explain why I wasn't there on Wednesday, and it'll be really embarrassing. Of course, in reality, none of those things are going to happen. But the negative mental filter has taken hold. You know the story of the man who decides, it's a good example. Man needs to borrow a hedge trimmer. And he knows that his mate in the next street has a hedge trimmer. And he thinks, I know, my mate Phil will lend me a hedge trimmer. And so he says, I'll go down and I'll ask Phil if I can borrow his hedge trimmer. So he goes out through the front door thinking, I'll see if, I'm sure Phil will lend me his hedge trimmer. By the time he's gone about 10 paces, he's sort of thinking, I'm not so sure that, after all, that Phil will lend me his hedge trimmer. He's a good bloke, but sometimes he can be a bit selfish. By the time he gets to the corner of his own street, he's thinking, you know what? I bet Phil will be really reluctant to lend me his hedge trimmer. He's a lot more selfish than he looks, you know. And I remember a time when he said something that wasn't very nice to me. By the time he turns into Phil Street, he's actually getting quite cross. He says, "Yeah, that Phil, yeah, he's got so many things, so many tools that he doesn't need, and he won't lend them to people. And I know darn well I'll get to his door and I'll ask for if I can borrow his hedge trimmer, and he'll tell me no and send me home again empty-handed, and I feel so embarrassed." By the time he gets to Phil's door, and Phil opens the door after he knocks it, what does he say to Phil? He says, "And you know where you can put your hedge trimmer." Now that's a funny story, but there's an awful lot of truth in the way that we tend to think like that. So another negative view about the thing that happens when we feel depressed or have a low mood is that we second guess, we mind read, we make assessments of how other people see us as being weak or stupid or useless. Usually, these things are not true, but we read into what we think is in their mind. So, in our example, John finally decides to go to church, but deliberately sits at the back near the door. Throughout the service, he worries about what others will say to him. He mind reads that they will think I'm an idiot and a waste of time. At the end of the service, he gets up quickly and leaves. Mark sees his pastor speaking to a group of people and walks across, demanding to know why they are discussing him. In fact, he was not even mentioned in the conversation. That's another example of negative thinking. I once remember, this is absolutely a true story, of being in conversation with a couple of deacons of my first church, and somebody coming across and saying, "Why are you talking about me?" We simply hadn't mentioned this person. But this is the kind of thing that can happen in anxiety and depression. Another thing that we tend to do is to bear all responsibility. Often we take responsibility for things. At its most extreme, we take responsibility in our minds for global disasters. There will sadly be people who are very disturbed in their mental health who will be absolutely convinced that they are responsible for the coronavirus. And there'll be no shifting that. And people in that situation tend to be very poorly in terms of mental health. But often we have a much more watered down version of that. We often will feel guilty and unfairly take responsibility for things. Do you feel the pressure for things to go well and blame yourself if things don't go as expected, even if you're not to blame? For instance, "I'll ruin the evening for everybody and it will all be my fault." An example that many people can identify with is the experience of feeling responsible for everyone else having a good time. If you invite friends round for a meal or a party, it's my responsibility to make sure that everybody enjoys themselves. People like this are prone to take things to heart. In anxiety and depression, the person often feels unfairly responsible for things that are really nothing to do with them, and they feel like this a lot of the time. And some of you will recognise yourself in all of this. So going back to our example, John's gone to church and he sat at the back, he's spoken to nobody, and he's bolted for the door as soon as the service is over. So what's happened to Anne? During the service, Anne notices John at the back of the church. She feels guilty that she may have upset him by being irritated with him when he phoned up saying he'd lost his wallet. Anne's also bothered. The numbers have been slightly down at the house group, and Anne starts thinking, you've guessed it, I'm not offering the right sort of supportive relationship there for people as the leader of the house group. It's all my fault that John didn't come on Wednesday. She then notices that he's left the church before she's had a chance to talk to him. You see, Anne has gone from being a supportive friend to somebody who in her own mind is a complete failure as the leader of her house group. In this type of unhelpful thinking style, very strong statements are often made. For instance, and we use extreme terms, we use hyperbole. It was completely useless, even when what actually happened wasn't anywhere near that bad. Sometimes we set ourselves impossible targets. It must be completely perfect, otherwise I'll be a complete and total failure. This thinking style causes us to use the words, and these are words that I always say to people, don't use them. Should, got to, must, and ought a lot. Often people who are suffering from poor mental health will beat themselves up with these words: I've got to, I should, I must, I ought to. We will also use words like always and never. I never do things right. I always get things wrong. We use extreme words and extreme statements because our mood is not good. It's really important to recognise this. And so Anne, in this situation, says to herself, as the house group leader, I must do my very best to make sure that everyone in the group feels God's presence. If they don't grow as a Christian, then I've totally failed as the leader and I'll have let God down in the work he's called me to. I've got to work harder at this. So here's the task in the book, and you might want to pause the video for a few moments and say, have I done this the last week or so? Have I been doing this? So there's a chart here on page 68, and I'll read this and see how many of these boxes you tick. An unhelpful thinking style is a bias against myself, and typically we think I overlook my strengths, I focus on my weakness, I downplay my achievements, I am my own worst critic. Second unhelpful thinking style, putting a negative slant on things, a negative mental filter. We think, I see things through dark tinted glasses. I always tend to focus on the negative in a situation. Another unhelpful thinking style is having a gloomy view of the future, jumping to bad conclusions, catastrophizing, imagining everything's going to be a disaster. Do you make negative predictions about the future? Do you predict that things will go wrong? Another unhelpful thinking style is a negative view of how other people see me. We read into what people think about me. I mind read what others think of me. I often think that others don't like me. Here's another unhelpful thinking style, the bearing all responsibility. I feel responsible for whether everyone else has a good time. I take things to heart. I take the blame if things go wrong. I take unfair responsibility for things that are not my fault. And then the final unhelpful thinking style is making extreme statements. I use words always, never, and typical a lot to summarize things. I make must, should, or ought statements to myself. Now, most of us, even if we have very good mental health, we'll identify with some of that. I rate my mental health as pretty good. I generally am an optimistic, upbeat person, but I recognize myself at times in almost all of that. And it's good to recognize that things are not really like that. So I don't know how many of those boxes, how many of those negative thinking styles you identified with. If you want to, just rewind the video and go back through them. The more of those that you identify with, the more likely you are to interpret things in a way which will make you feel worse about yourself and to lower your mood. Now, here's a key point. These unhelpful thinking styles are common and normal. In everyday life, most of us think in these ways at least some of the time. And normally such thoughts are relatively easily challenged, or they only make up a small part of our thinking. But if we are suffering from anxiety or depression, these things come into our mind more often. Not only do they come into our mind more often, they are harder to challenge and they're harder to overcome, and they cause us much more distress. You may notice that you are more prone to one of these unhelpful thinking styles than others. And you may find, particularly in the kind of stressful situation in which we all find ourselves, where we are confined in terms of what we can do, and we're aware that this extremely nasty virus out there, we may find ourselves in quite stressful circumstances. So, unhelpful thinking style has an impact on us. And it not only changes the way we feel, in the circumstances we mentioned, both Anne and John feel low and guilty. They may suffer physical symptoms of distress. They mind read, they second guess, they feel like they've been a disaster, they've let someone down, they've upset someone. And then behaviour changes. And this is where it gets really quite hazardous, because when we think like this, what happens is that our behaviour changes. So John, for instance, avoids eye contact with Anne. He cuts conversations short. He wants to leave. He wants to get away. There are physical changes in what he does. So what happens as a consequence of this? Here's the follow-on of this story of Anne and John, and the things that, if the negative is allowed to unravel, this is what will happen. Next Wednesday, John is due to go to house group that is being led by Anne. John thinks it'll go terribly. People will ask me where I was last week. I'll be embarrassed. So he has anxiety and physical symptoms of stress. His unhelpful thinking style is he makes negative predictions. He expects things to go badly. He jumps to the wrong conclusions. And the behaviour change, which is harmful for John, is he doesn't go to house group. He avoids it. Anne, in the same situation, in the house group where John has not now attended for 2 weeks, asks if someone will open the meeting in prayer. And we've all been here, if we've been leaders of anything. No one says anything. What does Anne do? Her thinking is altered. It's all gone wrong. I'm a useless leader. I'm no longer up to the job. Her emotional feelings change. I feel low and I have physical symptoms of anxiety. Her thinking develops into a bias against herself. And what does she do? Well, what she does, she jumps in after 30 seconds and prays herself because she's feeling uncomfortable and embarrassed. The next situation, next Sunday, Anne listens. Some of you will recognise yourself. Some of you watching this, I know, will recognise yourself in this. Next Sunday, Anne listens to the morning sermon. The preacher says, we must all try our very best to fulfil the roles that God has called us to. What then goes on in Anne's mind? I can't do it. People aren't growing as they should. I can't lead the group. Look at what's happened with John. I've really let John down. Of course, she hasn't, but that is her altered thinking. Her unhelpful thinking style is a bias against herself, feeling responsibility, taking things to heart. How does her behaviour change? Because this is where it has the impact. She goes home and she cries. She feels cut off from God and that she's unusable by him. And then she phones the minister to say that she's resigning from leading the house group. When this happens, people will usually find a pretext. I've got too much on, I'm too busy at work, and so on. But the real reason is something else, a feeling of inadequacy. Now, whilst these examples are taken from the everyday life of a church, which is the context that I understand better, they don't just operate in a church setting or in a spiritual setting. They operate in every circumstance of life. Negative thinking leads to a worsening of our mood. Negative thinking leads to reduced and avoided activities and the start of unhelpful behaviour. And this is where such things can actually become quite dangerous. What happens when we feel depressed or anxious is that we find it difficult to do things. And I know that some of you are experiencing this now. We, in spite of maybe having possibly more time on our hands, we have low energy. We feel tired even when we're not doing anything. We have a low mood and little sense of enjoyment or achievement when things are done. We have anxiety and fear. We fear talking to people. We fear physical, in the current circumstances, non-physical contact. We have negative thinking, and we end up in a situation we say, you know what, I just can't be bothered. And we may feel guilty because not only are we not being very active, not only are we becoming devoid of energy, but we're feeling guilty about it. And things that used to bring us pleasure no longer bring us pleasure. It can feel like everything is too much effort or just too difficult. And so a vicious circle of reduced activity may result, because all of these things are negative thinking, our bias against ourselves, our lowering of our mood leads to reduced activity, and the reduced activity in ourself takes us back to a lowering of mood. So you see what happens if our mood becomes low, then we think negatively about ourselves. This results in us doing less activity about which we feel guilty, and feeling guilty makes our mood even lower. And you end up with a kind of spiral that's going downwards, and our mood is getting worse and worse. We stop doing things, and everyday jobs, like even things like getting up, getting dressed, doing housework, even things that we used to enjoy become very difficult. It's really important to recognize that, and to recognize that the way we think, the way we feel, our mood affects the way we think about ourselves. It affects our judgment. We start using negative language about ourselves. We start using things like I must, I ought, I should, but it doesn't give us the energy to do it. We have a bias against ourselves. We write ourselves off as useless. The result of that is that we stop doing even simple things that we can do, sometimes even things like getting dressed. And this makes us, in turn, feel even worse about ourselves, and we beat ourselves up. One of the best bits of advice I had recently was when you get up in the morning, however you're feeling, make your bed. Because you'll have done something. Get dressed. Even if you're not going out, get dressed, have a wash, do your hair. The best way you can do your hair, given that none of us have seen a hairdresser for at least 3 weeks. Do the simple things, because not doing them will simply make you feel worse about yourself. So ask yourself, what things have I stopped doing because of my feelings of anxiety or because of a low mood? What activities have I not been partaking in? And what effect has this had on me? Sometimes in this situation, we can. No, I'm going to leave it there. Actually, I think that's enough for now. And I don't want to finish on a negative, because I do want to say that to improve the way that we feel, it's important to recognise this kind of negative pattern of thinking and the effect it has on us. The mind reading, the beating of ourselves up, and the bias against ourselves. But in recognising it, the idea is that if we know what's going on, we can then start to address it. We can start to say, what things can I do to improve my mental health by 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 changing my thinking, by challenging my negative mental filter, and what things can I do to improve my situation, even in a setting where there is so relatively little that you are able to do physically because of the restrictions that are placed on us. Do bear this in mind and be encouraged. In a few weeks' time, and you will be allowed out. At the moment, it feels like this lockdown is kind of going on forever. When we look back on this in a few months' time, it will seem a very short time. It will only be a number of weeks that we're in this situation. It'll be really good if we can reach a point where, when we are allowed to do things again, that we hit the ground running because we've maintained good mental health while we have been forced to be comparatively inactive. If you are if you're connecting with Whitley Lodge at all, please do feel free to ring me. Do feel free to put comments on here, any questions, and I will respond to them. And do try and stay in touch. Stay in touch with people who are good for you. Don't spend too long phoning people who bring you down. Spend time talking to and being with people who make you feel better about yourself. We've all got them. Identify them. And also, you be one of those people. Be one of those people who make others feel better, and break this cycle, if you're in it, of negative thinking. So I hope that's been useful, and I will try to put another one of these on tomorrow, which will talk about the impact of unhelpful thinking and behaviour, and how we might challenge some of that. So thank you for listening, watching, and God bless you. I will talk to you soon.